The first week in Ash Hollow passed quietly enough, though Ethan couldn't shake the strange feeling that hung over the town like a thick fog. During the day, the tracks seemed like any other, stretching through fields and wooded hillsides. But at night, they felt different. The air grew colder, and a strange tension seemed to settle in, like the whole area was holding its breath. Ethan spent most of his days checking the tracks for wear, clearing debris, and performing routine maintenance. The job was simple, monotonous even, and that was just the way he liked it. He enjoyed the solitude of walking along the tracks, the distant sound of birds calling from the trees, the occasional rumble of a far-off train. But it was the nights that were starting to get to him. One evening, as Ethan was finishing his shift, Harold stopped by to check in. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the station yard. Harold looked tired, his eyes sunken deep into his face as though the weight of some unseen burden was slowly crushing him. "Getting used to the place yet?" Harold asked, his voice hoarse. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it's quiet. Just what I wanted." Harold gave a faint smile but didn't seem convinced. "You've been out by mile marker 47 yet?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. Why?" Harold's smile faded completely, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. Then he looked at Ethan with an intensity that made the younger man uneasy. "Stay away from it. If you can, just avoid that section of track altogether." Ethan frowned. "What's out there?" Harold hesitated, glancing around as though the very mention of the place could summon something unwanted. "It's where the accident happened," he said quietly. "People say that's where the trouble starts." Ethan shrugged, trying to brush off the old man's warnings. "I'm not afraid of a few ghost stories." Harold didn't laugh. Instead, he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "I'm not talking about stories," he said, his voice grave. "There's something real out there, something that doesn't rest." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. He had heard plenty of ghost stories growing up, but there was something about Harold's tone that made this feel different, more tangible. "I'll be careful," Ethan said, trying to reassure the old man. Harold nodded but didn't seem comforted. "Just don't push your luck," he muttered before turning to leave. That night, as Ethan lay in his small rented room near the station, he couldn't get Harold's words out of his head. "Stay away from mile marker 47. Something that doesn't rest." Ethan tossed and turned, unable to shake the growing unease. He had never believed in ghosts or curses or any of that supernatural nonsense, but there was something about this town, about the tracks, that was beginning to get under his skin. A few days later, Ethan found himself assigned to inspect the section of track leading toward mile marker 47. The sun was already beginning to set by the time he reached the area, the sky a deep bruised purple. Ethan walked slowly, his eyes scanning the tracks for any signs of wear or damage. But despite his best efforts to focus on the task at hand, his mind kept drifting back to Harold's warning. The air grew colder the closer he got to the marker. A thick fog began to roll in, curling around the trees and tracks like a living thing. Ethan could hear the soft whisper of the wind through the pines. But there was something else, a faint, almost inaudible sound beneath it. It was like a distant echo, barely discernible but unmistakably human. Voices. He stopped in his tracks, listening intently. For a moment, the fog seemed to swirl and shift, forming vague shapes just beyond the edge of his vision. Ethan rubbed his eyes and shook his head, trying to clear the strange sensation from his mind. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. But as he approached mile marker 47, the voices grew louder, more distinct. He could hear the sound of laughter, a child's voice calling out, followed by the distant rumble of a train approaching. The fog grew thicker, obscuring his vision, and the temperature dropped even further. Suddenly, the sound of a train's whistle pierced the air, sharp and haunting. Ethan turned around, squinting into the fog, but there was no train in sight. The tracks remained still and silent. But the sound was getting louder. Ethan's heart began to race as he backed away from the tracks. He could feel the vibration beneath his feet, as though a train was rushing toward him. But when he looked again, the tracks were empty. Then, out of the mist, he saw it. A faint glow in the distance, like the headlight of an old locomotive cutting through the fog. The light grew brighter, and with it came the unmistakable sound of screeching metal and the roar of an approaching train. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the train seemed to materialize from nowhere, rushing toward him with terrifying speed. But there was something wrong with it, something that made his blood run cold. The train wasn't solid. It was translucent, ghostly, as if it existed in some other world. Through the windows, Ethan could see shadowy figures, passengers frozen in place, their faces pale and lifeless. The train roared past him, disappearing into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan stood there, frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The fog began to lift, and the air warmed again, but the strange feeling lingered. Ethan glanced down at the tracks where the ghostly train had just passed. There was nothing, no sign of any disturbance, no footprints, no evidence that anything had been there at all. Shaken, Ethan turned and hurried back toward the station, his mind racing. He didn't believe in ghosts, but what had he just seen? As he walked, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the faintest sound of a whistle, far off in the distance. Ethan didn't look back. Back at the station, Ethan couldn't shake the image of the ghostly train. He replayed the scene over and over in his head, trying to find a logical explanation for what he had witnessed. Maybe it was just the fog playing tricks on his mind, or perhaps fatigue from long hours on the job had caused him to hallucinate. Yet deep down, he knew that what he had seen was no illusion. As Ethan walked into the station office, Harold looked up from his desk. The old man's gaze lingered on Ethan for a moment, as if he already knew what had happened. "You've been out by mile marker 47, haven't you?" Harold asked, his voice low and gravelly. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "I saw something out there," he said quietly. "A train, but not a real one." Harold sighed and rubbed his face with a tired hand. "I warned you, didn't I? That place, it doesn't let go once it's got a hold on you." Ethan sank into a chair across from Harold, running a hand through his hair. "What the hell is happening here, Harold? That train. I could see the passengers. They looked dead." Harold nodded grimly. "They are. That train, the one you saw, is the ghost of the wreck that happened 50 years ago. It's been appearing ever since. People say it's the spirits of the passengers, still trapped, unable to move on." Ethan swallowed hard. "But why? Why are they still here?" Harold leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "No one really knows. Some say it's because the accident wasn't just an accident. There was something more to it, something dark. Others think the spirits are seeking justice, or maybe they're just lost and can't find their way. But whatever the reason, that stretch of track has been cursed ever since." Ethan sat in silence for a moment, trying to absorb the weight of Harold's words. He had always prided himself on being a rational man, someone who believed in science and logic. But now, sitting in this eerie station office, surrounded by the remnants of a town steeped in tragedy, he wasn't so sure. "There's more, isn't there?" Ethan finally asked. "More than just the train?" Harold nodded slowly. "The train's just the beginning. People have seen all sorts of things out there. Shadows moving in the fog, strange lights at night, voices calling from the darkness. And sometimes, people disappear, like the last guy who worked here." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What happened to him?" Harold shook his head. "No one knows. He was working a late shift just like you were tonight. Went out to check the tracks near mile marker 47. He never came back. We searched for days, but there was no sign of him. It's like he just vanished." Ethan felt a pit forming in his stomach. He had taken this job for the peace and quiet, for the simplicity of it all. But now, he was beginning to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. "So what do we do?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold sighed again. "We keep our heads down and do our jobs. Try to stay away from the cursed part of the tracks. And hope that whatever's out there doesn't come for us." Ethan nodded, but deep down he knew it wasn't going to be that simple. He had seen the train. He had felt its presence. and something told him that this was just the beginning. The next few days were uneventful, though the memory of the ghost train continued to haunt Ethan's thoughts. He avoided the section of track near mile marker 47, taking on assignments closer to the station. Yet every night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him. Then, one night, just as Ethan was about to drift off to sleep, he heard it again. The faint sound of a train whistle in the distance. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. He lay still, listening intently. The whistle came again, closer this time. Ethan sat up and looked out the window. The fog had returned, thick and swirling, and through it, he could see a faint glow in the distance, the same eerie light he had seen near mile marker 47. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He could stay in bed, pretend he hadn't heard anything, and wait for the strange phenomena to pass. But something compelled him to go out, to see if the ghost train had returned. Grabbing a flashlight in his coat, Ethan hurried out of his room and made his way toward the tracks. The cold night air bit at his skin, and the fog seemed thicker than ever, clinging to his clothes like damp wool. The whistle blew again, louder this time, echoing across the empty landscape. As Ethan approached the tracks, he saw the light again, cutting through the mist like a beacon. It was coming from the same direction as before, mile marker 47. He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. Every instinct in his body was telling him to turn back, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But he couldn't. Something, whether it was curiosity, fear, or a sense of duty, was pulling him toward the tracks. The light grew brighter as Ethan crept closer. The sound of the ghostly train filled the air, the metal screeching and grinding as it barreled down the tracks. And then, just like before, the train appeared out of the fog, its massive spectral form roaring toward him. But this time, Ethan didn't run. He stood his ground, watching as the ghost train rushed past him. The faces of the passengers were just as lifeless as before, their pale eyes staring blankly ahead. But now, there was something new, something that hadn't been there the first time. At the very end of the train, just as it passed Ethan, he saw a figure standing on the rear platform. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face obscured by shadows. The figure turned to look at Ethan, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The man's eyes were dark, hollow, filled with an emptiness that chilled Ethan to the bone. And then, as quickly as the train had appeared, it vanished into the fog, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Ethan stood there, frozen, his mind racing. Who was that man? And why had he been staring at Ethan with such intensity? As the fog began to lift and the night grew still once more, Ethan realized something. This wasn't just a haunting. There was something more to the ghost train, something connected to that man. And whatever it was, Ethan was now a part of it. He turned and hurried back to the station, his heart pounding. He didn't know what was happening, but one thing was certain. The ghost train wasn't just a relic of the past. It was still very much alive, and it had taken notice of him. Ethan's hands trembled as he locked the door behind him, his mind racing with the events that had just transpired. He couldn't shake the image of the man on the train, the way he had stared into Ethan's soul with those dark, hollow eyes. There was something profoundly wrong about it, and Ethan knew he was in deep, far deeper than he had ever intended to be. The next morning, Ethan found Harold sitting at his desk, sipping on a cup of coffee. The old man looked up as Ethan entered, his expression cautious. "You look like hell," Harold said, setting down his mug. "Didn't get much sleep, did you?" Ethan shook his head, slumping into the chair opposite Harold. "It came back last night, the train." Harold nodded slowly as if he had expected this. "It always does." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. But there was something different this time. There was a man on the back of the train. He looked right at me, like he knew I was there. Harold's expression darkened. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing. "That man, I've heard of him before. Some people say he was the conductor of the train when the accident happened. Others think he was one of the passengers. But no one knows for sure. What they do know is that he's been seen before, always on the last car, always watching. Ethan swallowed hard. Watching for what? Harold shook his head. I don't know. Some say he's waiting for something, or someone. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Waiting for who? Harold hesitated before speaking. In the years after the accident, people who saw the man on the train started disappearing, just like the last rail worker who vanished. There's a theory that the conductor, or whatever he is, takes people with him, brings them into that other world wherever the train is stuck. They're never seen again. Ethan's pulse quickened. So what does that mean for me? Harold looked at him gravely. I don't know, but if the conductor noticed you, it might not be good. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. The idea that the man on the train could somehow reach out from the beyond and take people with him sounded insane, but after what Ethan had seen, it didn't seem impossible. There's got to be something we can do, Ethan said, desperation creeping into his voice. We can't just sit around waiting for this thing to come for me. Harold sighed heavily. There might be a way to stop it, or at least protect yourself, but it's risky. Ethan leaned forward again. I'll do anything. Just tell me what I need to do. Harold glanced around the room as if ensuring they were alone, then lowered his voice. There's a woman who lives outside of town. People say she's a witch, though I don't know if that's true. What I do know is that she's helped people before, people who've had encounters with things like this. Ethan's skepticism flared for a moment. A witch? But after everything he had experienced, he wasn't about to dismiss anything that might help him. Where can I find her? Ethan asked. Harold gave him directions, warning him again that the woman, Mabel was her name, wasn't exactly friendly. She lived in a rundown house deep in the woods, far from the town's borders, and most people avoided her if they could. Just be careful, Harold warned. She's powerful, but she doesn't help people for free. The next day, Ethan set out for the woods, following Harold's directions to Mabel's home. The path was narrow and overgrown, winding through dense trees that seemed to close in around him the further he walked. The deeper he ventured into the forest, the darker it became, the sunlight barely piercing the canopy above. Ethan couldn't help but feel as though the woods themselves were watching him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. After what felt like hours, Ethan finally reached a small clearing where a dilapidated old house stood, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. The windows were dark, and the air around the place felt thick with an unnatural stillness. Ethan approached the door and knocked. For a long moment, there was no response, and he wondered if perhaps Harold had been wrong. Maybe no one lived here anymore. Just as he was about to turn away, the door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked as though she had stepped straight out of an old folk tale. Mabel was tall and thin, her face sharp and lined with age. Her long silver hair hung loosely around her shoulders, and her eyes were the color of storm clouds, cold and unforgiving. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly. Ethan swallowed hard, suddenly feeling very small under her piercing gaze. "I was told you could help me," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's something wrong with the railroad, and with me." Mabel studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. Then without a word she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. Ethan hesitated only for a second before stepping inside the dimly lit house. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and something else, something he couldn't quite place but which made his skin crawl. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of strange, unidentifiable substances, and in the center of the room stood a large wooden table, covered in various tools and trinkets. Mabel moved to the table and began to sift through the items, her movements slow and deliberate. "Tell me what's happening," she said, her back to him. Ethan took a deep breath and recounted everything. The ghost train, the passengers, the conductor, and how he felt like the train had marked him in some way. As he spoke, Mabel listened intently, occasionally nodding but never interrupting. When he finished, Mabel turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "The train is a powerful force," she said slowly. It's caught between worlds, trapped in a cycle of death and despair. The conductor, as you call him, is a spirit bound to that place. He's searching for something or perhaps someone to free him. Ethan frowned. What do you mean, free him? Mabel sighed. Spirits like his are tied to the physical world because of unfinished business. Sometimes it's guilt, sometimes it's vengeance. But whatever it is, it keeps them from moving on. He's looking for a way to break free, and you, whether you like it or not, have become part of that search. Ethan felt a chill run through him. So what do I do? Mabel moved closer to him, her eyes sharp and intense. There's a way to sever the connection between you and the conductor, but it won't be easy. You'll need to confront him directly. Ethan's stomach twisted. Confront him? How? Mabel reached into one of the jars on the shelf and pulled out a small bundle of dried herbs tied together with string. She handed it to Ethan. Burn this on the tracks where you first saw the train. It will draw the conductor to you. When he comes, you'll have a chance to break his hold over you. Ethan took the bundle of herbs, his hands trembling slightly. And how do I break the hold? Mabel's expression darkened. That depends on what he wants. You'll need to figure that out before it's too late. Ethan nodded, though his mind was swirling with uncertainty and fear. Thank you, he said quietly, pocketing the herbs. Mabel watched him for a moment before speaking again. Be careful, Ethan. Once you summon him, there's no turning back. As Ethan made his way back to town, the weight of Mabel's words hung heavy in his mind. He was walking toward a confrontation he didn't fully understand, with an enemy he couldn't see or predict. But he knew one thing for sure. If he didn't do something, the conductor would eventually come for him. And when that happened, there would be no escape. That night, Ethan prepared himself for what was to come. He packed a small bag with essentials, including a lighter for the herbs and a flashlight. His mind was racing, but he knew he had no choice but to go through with it. He couldn't live in fear forever. As midnight approached, Ethan made his way back to mile marker 47, his heart pounding in his chest. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around him like a living thing. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the distant whistle of the ghost train, echoing through the night. Ethan stood at the edge of the tracks, the bundle of herbs clutched tightly in his hand. He glanced around nervously, then knelt down and lit the herbs, watching as the smoke began to rise into the air. The smell was sharp and pungent, filling his nostrils and making his eyes water. For a moment, nothing happened. The night remained still and silent, the fog curling around him like a shroud. But then, out of the darkness, came the sound of the train. The tracks began to vibrate beneath his feet, and the whistle grew louder, more insistent. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw the faint glow of the train. The glow of the ghostly train cut through the fog, brighter and more menacing than ever before. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the vibrations from the tracks grew stronger. The whistle shrieked again, echoing in the still night air, and the train began to materialize out of the mist, its dark spectral form barreling toward him with terrifying speed. Ethan's legs threatened to buckle under him, but he forced himself to stay rooted in place. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to face the conductor. He had to break free. The train screeched to a halt just a few feet in front of Ethan, the smell of burning metal and ash filling the air. The ghostly passengers stared out at him from the windows, their eyes empty and lifeless. But Ethan's gaze was drawn to the figure standing on the rear platform, the conductor. The man was exactly as Ethan had seen him before, tall, with dark, hollow eyes and an old-fashioned uniform. But now, up close, Ethan could see the malevolent energy radiating from him. The conductor's gaze locked onto Ethan, and the air around them seemed to hum with a dark, oppressive power. For a long, agonizing moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the conductor's stare pressing down on Ethan like a physical force. Then, slowly, the conductor stepped off the train and onto the tracks, his form almost shimmering in the dim light. "You've come," the conductor said, his voice low and echoing as if carried from a great distance. "I've been waiting for you." Ethan swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What do you want from me?" The conductor's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You've seen the train. You felt its pull. Now you're part of it, whether you want to be or not. Ethan clenched his fists. I'm not going anywhere with you. The conductor tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. It's not your choice. You belong to the train now. You belong to me. Ethan took a step back, his heart racing. No, I don't. I'm here to stop this. The conductor laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. Stop this? You can't stop what's already been set in motion. The train is cursed, doomed to ride these tracks forever. And now, so are you. Ethan felt a surge of anger rise within him, cutting through his fear. I don't believe that. There has to be a way to break the curse. The conductor's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold indifference. You think you can escape? You think you can change what's been done? He took a step closer, and Ethan could feel the temperature around him drop. The only way to end this is through death. The conductor's words hung in the air like a death sentence, but Ethan refused to accept them. He remembered Mabel's advice, to find out what the conductor wanted. Something had bound him to the train, and if Ethan could figure out what that was, maybe he could sever the connection. What happened that night? Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Why are you still here? The conductor's eyes darkened, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Ethan thought he wouldn't answer, but then the conductor's voice came, softer this time, almost sad. There was an accident, the conductor said, his gaze drifting to the ghostly train behind him. A mistake that cost the lives of everyone on board. They were innocent, passengers with families, hopes, and dreams. But me, I was the one responsible. I failed them. Ethan felt a pang of sympathy, but he didn't let it distract him. So that's why you're still here. You're punishing yourself. The conductor's eyes flicked back to Ethan, the sadness replaced by anger. I'm bound to this train just as they are. Every night I relive the horror of that accident. Every scream, every death, over and over again. And now you've seen it. You're part of it. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. But you don't have to be. If you let go, if you stop punishing yourself, you can move on. You can free yourself. The conductor's face twisted in a mixture of rage and grief. You don't understand. I can't. The train, it won't let me. Ethan realized that the conductor wasn't just trapped by guilt. He was trapped by the curse itself, bound to the train by forces beyond his control. But if the conductor had been the one responsible for the accident, maybe he was the key to breaking the curse. I can help you, Ethan said, his voice firm. But you have to trust me. You have to let go of the past. The conductor stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, his shoulders slumped, and the anger seemed to drain from him. I don't know if I can, the conductor whispered. I've been here for so long. Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. You have to try. If you don't, this will never end, for you or for them. The conductor hesitated, his eyes flicking to the train and then back to Ethan. Finally, he nodded, a look of resignation crossing his face. I'll try. Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of relief. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bundle of herbs Mabel had given him. He lit the bundle and held it up, letting the smoke rise into the air. Let this be the end, Ethan said, his voice steady. Let the train rest. The smoke swirled around them, filling the air with its pungent scent. The conductor closed his eyes, and for a moment everything was still. Then, slowly, the ghostly train began to fade, its form growing dimmer and more transparent. Ethan watched as the passengers inside the train began to disappear, their ghostly forms dissolving into the mist. The train itself began to disintegrate, its metal frame crumbling away into nothingness. And then, finally, the conductor himself began to fade, his form growing lighter and more transparent. As the last remnants of the train disappeared into the night, the conductor turned to Ethan one final time. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely audible, for giving me peace. And then he was gone, leaving Ethan standing alone on the tracks. The fog began to lift, and the air around Ethan grew warmer. The oppressive weight that had hung over the area was gone, replaced by a calm, peaceful silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, the railroad was just that, a simple stretch of tracks cutting through the countryside. Ethan stood there for a long time, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. He had done it. The curse had been broken. The train and its conductor were finally at rest. With a deep breath, Ethan turned and began the long walk back to the station, the weight of the encounter slowly lifting from his shoulders. He knew that the memory of the ghost train would stay with him for the rest of his life, but now, at least, he could live without the fear that it would come for him again. As he walked, he thought of Harold and Mabel, two people who had been caught up in the strange supernatural events of the railroad for far too long. He hoped that, with the curse broken, they too could finally find peace. Ethan didn't know what the future held for him, but one thing was certain. He would never forget the haunted tracks and the ghostly train that had once roamed them. But now, at least, the nightmare was over. The tracks were finally silent.